So welcome. I appreciate all of you coming today. I am Michelle Lewandowski. I am the director of the School Sisters of Notre Dame North American Archives, and I am also the president of the Archivist for Congregations of Women Religious, ACWR, who is hosting this webinar today. So this webinar is part of a 5-part series geared towards leadership and archivist for congregations of women religious. The purpose of these webinars is to sort of dovetail up against the Religious Archives and Translation Toolkit, which was released in September. And so the purpose of the toolkit is to help communities in transition prepare their archives for a move to either another facility, a collaborative archives, university, or wherever they may go. And these are meant to provide some more detailed information about specific pieces of the toolkit. So today we have Amy Cary, which I will introduce in a second, who is going to talk about contracts or archival contracts or agreements. On January 15th, we will be having a discussion about restrictions, what sorts of materials should be restricted, what shouldn't be restricted, and options for restrictions. On February 19th, we will be doing how to prepare your collection for a move. So kind of basic highlights of everything you need to know if you actually got to pack up and move. I will actually be speaking at that one. I've moved 3 collections, so I don't know if there is such thing as an expert in moving, but I guess I'm as close as we can get. And then the final one will be on March 19th, and that is going to be an update on the collaborative archives. So I please encourage you to join us at these if you are able to. There will be time for questions with Amy at the end. So just please make sure you're muted, and I will get Amy introduced. So Amy Cooper Cary is the head of the Archival Collection and Institutional Repository at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She has been at Marquette for 12 years and has been archivist and archival educator for 25 years. Amy has served multiple roles in the Midwest Archives Conference and in the Society of American Archivists, and is currently editor of the American Archivist and a fellow of the Society of American Archivists. She's really knowledgeable. She was actually one of my professors when I was in school way back when. And I think she is going to bring a lot to this subject. So I hope this is going to be really, I think this is a topic that all of us can really learn a lot about. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Amy, and welcome.
Thank you. Good to see everybody. Hello. I'm very pleased to be here and chat with everybody. As Michelle said, we'll have time for questions at the end. Basically, I want to just talk today a little bit from the perspective that I bring. I am not a lawyer, I will say that. But we will talk a little bit about contracts and what implications they have for us as archivists. This presentation is really based on best practice in the profession, and for that reason, I set out a series of resources that may be useful to you. We can talk a little bit about that. So best practice in the profession and also on personal experience. Some of it comes from the position of a repository, which is important for you to know both if you are still in a process of collecting materials, but also if you have the eventuality of being a donor. So feel free to ask questions, but we will have time for questions at the end. So with that, the first thing that I wanted to get started with is the Society of American Archivists core values and ethics statement. And I didn't bring this up, which I should have, but I know right where it is. And I'm going to pull it up on my screen, and I'm going to share my screen so that you can see this. There we go. So the reason I want to address just this basic core value statement is it's an area, it covers all areas of archival practice, but I want to highlight a couple of key points. In um, in the statement about judgment right here, it says that archivists should be transparent about their role in the selection, retention, and creation of the historical record by carefully documenting all collections related policy decisions. This is something that has direct implication for contracts and for donations. And then in the statement on access and use, it says archivists strive to minimize restrictions and maximize the ease of access. Archivists work with creators, donors, organizations, and communities to ensure that any restrictions applied are appropriate, well documented, and equitably enforced. Archivists should seek to balance the principles of stewardship, access, and respect. And I like those phrases because I think that when it comes to approaching donations, either collecting or being a donor, those are the three things that really drive how we approach them is stewardship, access, and respect. So I want to talk, like I said, today from two perspectives, from the perspective of the repository and from the perspective of the donor. And I want to address both of those. Now, mind you, I have been in academic archives for my entire career. So I know that there are differences in each repository, but what I'm talking about today are some of the things that in practice ultimately is a commonality between all of us. All of us address preserving the archival record, and that's what we're here to do. We're all here to support the work of archives. So that's what I want to start with. So repositories. Repositories will all be a little bit different. They have different deeds of gift. They have different expectations of donors. But the guidelines that I want to lay out will help you think about all the areas of donations. Donations need to consider donors need to consider where records will be best stewarded, where they're going to be best cared for. The answer to that is different for every individual, for every institution, for every community. That question is something that you think about in a very large context. There are a number of collaborative projects, which I know that you'll be talking about in coming weeks. Many of you are, I'm sure, already familiar with most of them. The Catholic Religious Archives at Boston College, Women Religious Archives Collaborative in Cleveland, the Heritage Research Center at Notre Dame. So there are a lot of different organizations that are seeking ways to bring together these collections in an organized way. And as donors, I think that there are a few things to consider. And one of those is, are you expected to pay a fee for inclusion? A lot of times people will ask me that about accepting material into our archives. Typically, academic archives do not have some kind of fee, but collaboratives may have some fee structure. So that's something to look into. What materials and formats do they accept? And we're going to talk a little bit about the types of materials that typically come in here. But But again, that might influence uh, how you prepare a donation. And then what does the deed of gift do? What rights does the deed of gift ask you to turn over? So I want to start us off by talking specifically about deeds of gift. They can be called deeds of gift. They can be called transfer agreements. People use a lot of different terms, but today I'm going to focus on what we actually have, which is a statement of gift. And these are typically, well, they're kind of your first step, right? So getting yourself to a donation, getting yourself to the point where you are either one, signing a deed of gift to turn over a collection, or two, presenting a donor with a deed of gift. Either way, you can look at it from both perspectives, right? Um, Sometimes it's easier than others. As an institution will consider what they want to acquire. So, for example, correspondence, memoirs, diaries, photographs, scrapbooks, professional papers, things that document the history of an individual or the history of the organization. If you think about it in terms of documenting, uh, creating a documentary record, you kind of understand the types of material that become important. If you're thinking about, for example, um, the records of a religious community, you might also include things like annual reports or marketing or promotional material, things like that that actually show the experience of the organization over time. So that's what any institution that is collecting materials is going to look at. How do we document the history of the individual or the organization over time? What are those records? And then consider the formats that you might have. Correspondence oftentimes is largely digital. So any repository that you're thinking of making a donation to, you'll probably want to address electronic records with them. The the big confusing term, right? Everybody's like, oh, electronic records. Well, it's not that bad. It really is not terrible. But any correspondence these days is largely digital. There's a lot of paper, but there's now a large digital component that you have to think about. If you think about things like diaries, things in your holdings, you may have physical format materials, but you may also have individuals who are creating diaries through things like blogs or web pages or even social media. So you need to think about how that documentation is going to impact a donation. Images today, almost exclusively digital, and they have been almost exclusively digital for a number of years. So any institution that you are considering as a landing place for your materials needs to be ready to take on those kinds of different alternate formats. Likewise, as you are collecting, you need to think about how you are gathering those formats in from the sisters who are currently placing materials in your archives. Um, Again, looking at that both ways. Uh, any institution that is collecting, whether that is you or an institution that you are thinking about working with, needs to be prepared to say no, to say, no, we can't accept that format. We can't accept that much material. You have to, you really have to think about capacity and the ability, and discuss this with either the donor or with the institution where you're donating material. How much material is there? How big is the collection? What is the majority of the format? Are there multiple formats? Things like this will be very, very important for you. And as you'll see in this deed of gift, there's also a provision within that to deaccession material if you decide during the processing that that it's unnecessary. So part of our responsibility as archivists in acquiring material, and this is, again, if you're acquiring material or the institution that you're considering, part of that responsibility in acquisition is not only to gather the material and to keep it, but to be able to shepherd it, to be able to steward it going forward. And that means that you have to be able to keep it, to describe it so that people know what is there, to provide access to it over time, and to preserve it in the long term. So think about all of the archival practices that you undertake, right? The institution that you're considering to move those materials to needs to be equally capable of providing all of those services. And that's something that you can keep in mind just as you're thinking about donations, whether they're coming into you or whether they are or whether you're making that donation going forward. So deeds of gift. And typically you have these agreements. You've been working with them, right? You have people who are turning material over to you, and deeds of gift are contracts. They're basically forms that set out an agreement between a repository and a donor about how those materials are treated during transfer. So those agreements themselves, if they're coming to you as a donor, the agreements have probably already been vetted by legal counsel at the institution where you're considering making a donation. I'm going to share my screen and show you our sample deed of gift, but I think you already have this as a handout. Let me just share. There we go. Okay. So this is the sample deed of gift that we have here and we use in our repository. And typically, like I say, this is something that has been vetted. It's something that we've had to our legal counsel take a look at. What happens to a collection without a deed of gift? The deed of gift sets out how this collection is going to function within the structure that you are providing, either within your own repository as a donor or for you donating materials to another repository. So if without a deed of gift, a donor might rescind the donation. Even worse, might claim that the material was placed there unethically. Researchers may want to use the material but not be able to publish from it, not be able to use images or lengthy quotes. You may not even have the ability to transfer it to another repository without appropriate deeds of gift. So it's a very, very important document and something for you to think about in both of these contexts. Typically, it follows a very basic structure. You have the donor name, uh, you have who it's being donated to, um, and then you have a description of the gift. And here I've I've put collection name, but um, oftentimes this includes a description of the size of the material, maybe the number of boxes or the number of linear feet. Um, if you're making a very, if you're making this very large donation, it may be that you have an entire inventory that you provide to the organization in order to more fully describe. When we accept large donations, I often ask the donors if they do have an inventory of the material, just so that I can attach it to this deed of gift and know what's coming in ahead of time. Um, and then you have the transfer of ownership, the transfer of the materials themselves. So here, grants, assigns, and transfers to the university possession and title to the collection, herein referred to as the materials. And then it also transfers intellectual property, that is copyrights. And in this case, you can see that it includes copyright and literary property rights to the materials insofar as the donor holds such rights. So if you as a donor are donating an entire collection and there is a collection of copyrighted articles in your holdings, well, you don't own copyright to those articles. You can't transfer copyright of those articles to the donor. The donor will recognize that, or the institution will recognize that. So um, that transfer of intellectual property, whether you're accepting that into your own collections or whether you're transferring to another collection, is interesting. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, because this is where you run into problems of orphan collections or orphan works. Oftentimes in an agreement, they will specify access terms or other restrictions. In this case, the donor can reclaim possession if they are not being maintained in alignment with professional archival standards. There may be other means for repository to say, for example, a part of our statement of gift used to be, if the institution is no longer known as a Catholic institution, that might be something that you would see in a donor agreement that would be important. So and then there are typically statements about the separation of materials. The archives may dispose of any portion of the materials which it determines to have no permanent value or historical interest. So in this case, the donor shall be given opportunity to reclaim these materials or otherwise direct their disposition. So we give the donor the ability to say, if we refuse something or we don't during the processing procedure, if we decide that something isn't pertinent, we will come back to the donor and say, here are the materials that we have separated out from the collection. Would you like them? You can waive that. So if you're a donor and you don't want to have that right, that can be removed. This is just a template. It's not written in stone by any stretch of the imagination. And then there are any restrictions notwithstanding any other restrictions. And I know that you're going to talk about restrictions in an upcoming event, but restrictions do need to be mentioned in the deed of gift. They do need to be addressed here. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. And then in this case, we state that Wisconsin law controls this document. If you're donating to an institution that is not in your home state, there may be other law that supersedes what where you are. So you just need to be sure that that is spelled out in the deed of gift. And then it's signed and witnessed. And we actually have witnesses by the donor and witnesses by the university. So that the signature is not only is not just one person to one person or one institution to one institution. It is actually witnessed. So so I'm going to stop sharing for just a minute, and I'm going to talk just a little bit about those concerns about restrictions. And like I say, you're going to address restrictions at another session. Restrictions here are usually those that are set out by the donor. So in this case, if you're making a donation to an institution, you will want to talk with them about what restrictions they can and should enforce. The biggest one that comes up, I think, in most conversations with donors is a concern for privacy. There are laws regarding privacy, and privacy on a person's death. Laws of privacy no longer pertain to people once they've passed on. So it's important that you think about restrictions versus access. And the repository will typically have an approach that they take. In the academic repositories where I have been over the course of my career, we favor open access. And so typically when we accept materials, we really ask donors to make sure that any restrictions that they are applying are either time delimited, material is restricted for 20 years, or material is restricted for 50 years, or until after the death of the donor, things like that. And we, like I say, we tend to favor open access. So if there seems to be a donor imposed limitation that is trying to, like, if it seems inequitable, we may make a comment or may ask the donor to reconsider that. Sometimes the archivist can impose restrictions, and that is something that should come out in a deed of gift. Donor imposed restrictions always are in the deed of gift. An archivist imposed restriction really should come into the deed of gift. But archivists sometimes in the process of processing materials will find materials that they say, well, this should be restricted. Again, those should be time delimited and they should be relatively rare. Archivists might impose restrictions if there are materials that seem particularly volatile or particularly intense, or if there are things like personally identifying information, within the materials themselves, phone numbers, social security numbers, things like that. And those can be addressed also in other ways. So restrictions are tricky, but they definitely should be discussed with the donor. If you are making a donation, you should insist on discussing restrictions with the repository that is taking your materials. And getting that into the agreement so that it's clear for everybody. If it's not clear, you run into problems down the road. People want to use the materials. You say it's restricted. Why is it restricted? I'm not sure. You need to be able to explain to researchers why they can't use material or what the policy is. So this really, really needs to be documented, and it needs to be in that deed of gift. There are other ways that records are transferred into organizations, and this typically is so moving from a deed of gift, where a deed of gift, a donor approaches an institution, says, we want to give you the records. Here are the things that you need to think about and need to consider. However, within institutions, there are also records transfer. Records transfer agreements are usually internal. So, for example, I'm sure that, one religious community might be transferring to a more centralized office, right? There would be a records transfer form that would go along with that. And I want to share just what our transfer form looks like. We do have a transfer form that we use in the university archives because we have organizational records that are coming from places like the office of the president or the office of the provost or individual schools or colleges. And those records are then transferred into the archives. These are, like I say, typically internal. They're less complex than a deed of gift. I would not recommend thinking about this if you are making a donation to an outside institution, right? But if you're thinking, if there are records that you're transferring within the larger structure of the organization, this might be something that you would run across. So those usually have a description of the material, and that might include a brief inventory. It's helpful if it does. You can see here, fill it out, but provide as a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet. So this is what we ask. And then we ask for a record schedule. This is when certain materials can be destroyed or can be returned to the transferring office so that they can be destroyed. So, for example, personnel records, right? Personnel records typically don't come to the archives. And if some did land in the archives, we would say, okay, we need to have a schedule so that we can destroy those. Those are not materials that would be open for research. You might get records from in Marquette, for example, we receive records from Student Health Services, right? And we will set those on a schedule to send them back to Student Health Services after a certain amount of time so that they can destroy those records. But they have to be kept for a certain amount of time. So that record schedule may or may not apply it's just something to think about, especially if you're making a donation to an organization and you have something that has the potential to be restricted, like personnel records or other types of sensitive material like that. And then again, restrictions. For example, in this case at Marquette, presidential records and records of many other administrative offices, they're closed for 25 years after the individual has left office. So we just recently opened up the records of President Giulio. We have a long time before the next set of presidential records open up because that was Father Wilde, and he left office and quite relatively recently, certainly within the 25-year period. So just think again, this is restrictions or handling for archival retention, and then just the basic information, the college or the office, who's authorizing it, date, the number of containers, how much is coming. And this is kind of your very, very basic, this is the most basic deed of gift that you can get. But in the case of a transfer form, there's no question of ownership because Marquette already owns its own records. So you can think of that condition of ownership as if somebody is from outside your organization is donating to you, you want to establish that the institution owns those records. In this case, it's internal. Marquette owns its own records. We're just moving them from one office into the archives. So I want to stop there for just a minute and ask what clarification you'd like on that or what kinds of questions you might have just on the deed of gift and a transfer form. What is an orphan collection? That's a lovely question. An orphan collection, and we will talk a little bit more about this because I'm going to mention use, but an orphan collection is a collection where it's been transferred. It may have been transferred without a deed of gift, so you don't really know who transferred it, when they transferred it, what they transferred, and somebody wants to come in and use the material. And if they want to come in and use the material, the deed of gift establishes that you have ownership and legal right to give people the ability to use the materials, right? If that isn't specified and you don't know where to direct the person, the donor has died, you can't trace back to an heir or somebody else who can give permission to use the material, then the collection is orphaned. You, as an archives, cannot say, okay, I own the permission to this. I can let you use this photograph. I can let you use this image in your publication. You can't do that if you don't have appropriate rights that are established, and the deed of gift does that. Does that answer that question?
Amy,
I see nods.
yeah, I was going to say we have another question in the chat, which is if a collection is fully processed when donated, can a donor specify in the agreement that absolutely nothing in the collection can be withdrawn, discarded, destroyed, rearranged, or rehoused? Basically, like accept it as is, don't make any changes.
I think that depends on the repository that you're donating to. Now, in some of these collaboratives, I could see them allowing that, but I don't know. I haven't seen their agreements, and most of the collaboratives are in a building stage. So I expect that that would be something that you would have to negotiate with them. From a perspective of a repository that would accept things for donation, I would not accept materials under that condition. The reason being that institutional repositories try to at least impose some kind of consistency on how they are working with collections. So if you go to, for example, our finding aids, you can see that most of those collections will have certain elements in their structure, and materials will be organized in a specific way by series, by types of material. Whereas if somebody sent in a collection that was all organized by number, and they numbered all of the documents, that might be really, really difficult for you to manage. So as a repository, you have to think about how you can manage material, and what the best how you can manage that to make it accessible. If you were just a storage repository and you weren't going to provide access, there would be no reason to think about that. You'd just be a storage area forever, and that would just stay there. But for use and for ongoing work with the collection, it does make a difference. So something that would be hard to, I think you'd be hard pressed to be able to say that.
There was a second part to the question, and it was, can you request that finding aids not be rewritten, edited, or changed? And I just want to add to that a smidge, because one of the things with women religious collections is I think our histories are very misunderstood and can be misinterpreted by people that aren't as in depth in the collections. So I wonder if like maybe you can't do it with the collections, but with the finding aid, where you can say, I've written it so that this has all the contextual information you need. We don't want it changed.
If you don't change the finding aid, you can't change the collection. So, I mean, the finding aid is the descriptive representation of what you have in your boxes. That's how you find stuff. So. So I think that really is something, and I agree with you, Michelle. I think that there are, there's certainly concerns about how people use materials, but there are concerns about that for all kinds of materials. I deal with all of the Native American collections here at Marquette, and there are people who are, trying to use those for all kinds of different purposes. Um, uh, and I'm just thinking, if I were to transfer those wholesale to a different repository, would I say, well, you can't change the way that the collections are structured? No, I would not. I would not. I would trust the archival expertise in the institution that you're transferring to. And quite frankly, I think that uh, you know, I would hope that any institution that you are considering transferring to would have this conversation with you before you make that donation. This is why I say donations are very hard to get to, because you really have to make sure that all of the interests of the collection, the donor, and the accepting repository are being balanced in this case. So that's why, we had originally said archivists seek to balance the principles of stewardship, aspect, access, and respect, and that can be respect for the individuals, but it's also respect for the collections. So it's a conversation you'll need to have. Other questions? I'm just pulling up the chat here to see. I'm not seeing all of them, so because I didn't see that second one.
I think that's all I've seen in the chat.
And I don't see any hands. So nobody's going to jump in and make a comment. Share your voices. we'll do that in the conversation. That's fine. Um, okay, and I want to leave us plenty of time, so I'm going to kind of move through a couple of other. Oh, all collections may necessitate rehousing over time. Yeah, absolutely. They certainly do. It's a great point, Holly. And you're going to have to think about how collections need to be reformatted, right? There might be material that uh, in the collections that is too fragile to handle and might need to be digitized, or entering into electronic materials. You're going to find that you um, you constantly have to reformat materials, and electronic files are much more difficult to deal with than physical files because they require item level, right? Item level work. So, so thank you. That's a very, very good point as well. Um, so moving on just briefly, I wanted to talk a little bit about oral history agreements. I know a number of repositories have them, and a number of repositories try to want to collect them. Oral history agreements have all the same concerns of deeds of gift. They have all of the same concerns about ownership. They have all of the same concerns of copyright. They have all of the same concerns of potential restrictions. If you are collecting them, you need to make sure, and on the resources form, I've put in a couple of what I think are really excellent resources, especially the Oral History Association guidelines, forms, and samples. That's really useful if you're collecting them. If you have them in your collections, again, this is an area where you're really going to want to talk to the institution where you're thinking about placing your materials, because if those oral histories come to you and they don't have access agreements or permissions to share out that material, you're not going to be able to do it. You might be able to transfer them, but they won't be able to provide access. So there are a few things that you want to consider. The legal release is the primary among them, and that would be granting permission for use, granting copyright. Basically, does this person agree to have both the oral history placed in your institution? And then does it give you the permission to move those materials or to transfer them or to provide access to them? So this is something that is very, very important. For example, we have a collection here of oral histories and transcripts that were from women who were surveyed about birth control in the 1940s and 1950s. Those materials were gathered, and the interviews were done, I think, in like the 1970s, but they never had any kind of permission to share. And so those materials cannot be used individually. We can't release, we can let people use them in aggregate, but we can't give them permission to publish quotes or other segments of those oral history interviews because we don't have permission to do that. So it's really kind of a consideration that you need to think about. Especially if interviewees are concerned about privacy, right? And in this case, these interviews were done in the 70s. That's 50 years ago, but some of those people could still well be alive. They may be in their 70s, they may be in their 80s. So it's not something that, you probably have to restrict that for a good long time. Um, uh, if you do have oral histories or you're gathering oral histories, can interviewees edit a transcript? You provide interviewees a transcript of their materials. Can they edit that? Can they restrict certain segments of their interviews or withdraw the interview entirely? They don't want it included in the collection. These are things, again, to think about. And it's especially important if you're thinking about transferring them into another repository, which then needs to manage those materials and manage access to those materials. So the agreements that I put into the resource guide, I'm not going to run through them on the websites. You can go to the websites, look at what is available there. It's always helpful to read through many different agreements, and that's why I also gave you plenty of examples of deeds of gift. These will help you kind of determine what is appropriate for you in your repository, because
I'm sorry, I'm listening to a thing on archives. I can't get you.
Oh, I
go down there when
thank you. So that's why I gave a number of examples. Take a look at the examples, see what you think is appropriate, see what you think is useful, but just keep these things in mind, that the deed of gift or the transfer agreement or the agreement for oral histories, all of these have implications for you as a collector and as a donor. And that's the most important thing for you to think about how you balance this out. And finally, I wanted to talk about use of materials because use of materials also implies an agreement, right? And this is especially used for publication, um, but it has implications that often come out in looking at the deed of gift. So one last time, I'm going to share my screen and show you, and again, you have a copy of this, but this is our application that allows people to request permission to print or publish or exhibit material from our collections. Most often, this is photographs, right? Most often people are asking us how they can use images. And so use of materials often is determined in the deed of gift. It falls under the aspect of restrictions. Either the donor might retain the rights to give permission to use materials. For example, the collection of the Red Cloud Indian School Holy Rosary Mission, they have, you see right here, they have their own form. They oversee the rights to use, to grant permission to use materials. We have all of the stuff here. Without their permission, I cannot serve that to people to publish from. So and this is something for you to consider again as you're donating material. Do you retain the rights? You give the material, the physical material, to an institution, but you retain the rights to that material, and you retain the right to control the use of it. This is, again, something that's really important. So when we ask for material, for information from researchers, we're asking them about the nature of their request. Is it for personal use? Typically, we'll document it, but that will be the only thing that we do. If it's for personal use, that might be someone contacted me and said, I want to use this image in a timeline that I'm creating about my great grandmother. Fabulous. Go for it. Published material is a little bit different, and published is not just a book or an article. Publication could be on a website. It could be in a blog. So think about publication broadly. And often we'll ask how they are publishing it and when, and then we ask them for what they are using. And then we have a number of, again, it's a contract, right? So we specify permissions. In this case, permissions are typically one-time project related. We do negotiate a fee for use. That may or may not be the case with the repositories that you're considering donating to, but it's something for you to think about. Are they charging use fees? And are you turning over those rights to the donor institution to do that? You want to be clear about the citation that they will use. And this is something that you can think about. Again, think about it in the context of the repository that you're making a donation to. We would, for example, a full citation would be a specific collection, a box and folder number, archival collections and institutional repository, Rayner Library, Marquette University. So this is not the full citation. This is only part of a full citation. And the collection name should be in there, but you need to be clear about how you want people to know about the collection. You may be able to grant copyright, but if you're not, you can say that the person asking to use the material is responsible for the copyright, and that, again, is important. And then in this case, you're asking about can you alter a finding aid or a description. In this case, we say that you can't alter images. You can't change an image. I actually had an instance where I declined to have an image used for a movie because they wanted to change it in ways that were not that would misrepresent the image. So you can think about that. Now, these use agreements are probably negotiated by the institution that you would be donating your materials to, but you should ask to see what their use policies are if you're thinking about making a donation to another institution. What are their use policies? What if you are signing over copyright? Oh, okay. Thank you, Michelle. If you have assigned copyright, what kind of use policies are they enforcing at that institution? And this document is clear. This is how we allow people to use materials within our purview to provide copyright. So that's another thing that you need to think about, is how those materials will be used. Yes, in the Archives in Transition Toolkit. Great. So I am going to stop for another minute here. and see what questions you have. And these get questions about anything.
There was a question in the chat. Are deeds of gift similar to commercial and confidence contracts, meaning that they can't be shared with anyone else?
A signed deed of gift is a confidential document. We would never provide access to a signed deed of gift to a researcher, for example. We keep those in our digital files, and we actually keep the physical copies in our vault. But a lot of people will share examples, like blank examples of deeds of gift. And it's perfectly fine if somebody, if you are considering donating material to a repository, if you came to me and you said, I'm thinking about donating material to Marquette, can we have a conversation? And can I see your standard deed of gift? I would say, absolutely, sure, here you go. And the other thing is that based on a conversation with the donor, whether you're collecting or making a donation, the institution can and should be able to alter the deed of gift to address any of your needs and questions. So the deed of gift is a template. It's not written in stone, like I said before. We will make sure that conditions that are set by the donor are included in the deed of gift.
Are there any other questions?
Is somebody going to? Can the donor share her deed of gift without other outside organizations? Could I share mine with another Sisters of St. Joseph archivist who may be considering the repository? You mean, can you share?
I think she means like if she donated her collection to Marquette, could she show the contract she signed with Marquette to other communities who might be considering Marquette?
That's up to you. I mean, yes, we consider them to be confidential documents, but what you do with them in your own, that's your copy. And a copy typically is signed by the institution, countersigned by the donor, and then a copy is given both to the donor and to the institution. So you have a signed copy. And I have never specified to a donor that they can't share their signed deed of gift. It's fine. But we would not share a signed deed of gift. I would not share that out with anybody. Have I managed to confuse everybody so much that you're being silent?
I think you did a great job. I think this is just a really complicated topic. I mean,
It is.
Anybody who's done it, you know, it's very complicated.
It is very complicated. And, you know, I think that it really is an ongoing conversation that an institution has with a donor, whether you are collecting or whether you are making a donation. It's a conversation, and hopefully what this presentation does is gives you an idea about what questions you need to ask, what questions you need to keep in mind, and thinking about just really having a very frank conversation with the repository. The repository is responsible for providing you with this information. But let me say, the repository is also responsible. The repository is also responsible for making sure that they are representing themselves appropriately. You know, for example, when here Cardinal Stritch College recently closed and its archives, you know, they approached us, but they also approached a couple of other places in Milwaukee, and as we were talking and thinking about what the best disposition for these materials were, it was up to me as the archivist to say, one, the collection's quite large and it would take up a lot of our empty storage. Is that something that we could reasonably do? Do we have the space to take it? Do we have the ability to reformat what needs to be reformatted? Do we have the ability to take on different formats of records? And is this the best place for those materials? And actually, in conversation, we decided that this was not the best place for those materials. So the institution, the repository, whether that's you know, one of the collaboratives or an academic institution or an historical society or anywhere else, you need to make sure that you're having a frank conversation with them based on these contents, based on what their deed of gift says, based on what restrictions you're concerned about, based on what formats you have. You need to make sure you're having a frank conversation with them about what their capacity is, what is their ability to provide ongoing stewardship to these records, because that's the thing, right? Back when I first started this position, I went to the conversation workshop in Boston years and years ago when we were first talking about the concerns and the need to preserve these important documents, right? Documenting the communities of women religious and how vulnerable they were, right? How vulnerable the record is. And the biggest issue that I heard were people saying, you know, we want to make sure that the record is preserved for history, right? That's what we want. It's important to preserve it. It's even more important to make sure it's accessible. And so that I would just keep that in mind, forefront in your mind as you're thinking about where these records need to go. Let me see the chat. Thank you to Andrea for that very fine comment. Stacy, how are the terms of a deed of gift enforced after the collection is transferred to a repository? Can the donor designate a law firm or other entity to conduct an annual audit or similar? Well, I've never had a law firm or anybody else conduct an audit. The terms of the deed of gift, gosh, it's interesting. I mean, if you as an entity think for some reason that the institution that you are donating to would not agree, it would not hold to the terms of the deed of gift, that's not a good placement for those materials. That is not a trustworthy repository. I suppose that you could designate someone to conduct an audit, but quite frankly, I've never heard of that in 25 years. I think that, you know, archival ethics, I mean, this is an ethical issue, right? And archivists hold to a set of ethical approaches to materials, and one of those is stewardship of the materials. Thank you, Andrea. Yeah, I haven't heard of it. But it doesn't mean that you can't, the community can't ask questions. I do have, right. Yeah, choices are limited. Um, but I think, again, this is where you work through the donation process, and you talk about what their deed of gift actually says and what they're asking you to turn over, and how are they going to steward the materials going forward. And I have had organizations come back and say, okay, I have this, you have this material. How is this being handled? Or we've gone back. For example, we have a collection of photographic materials in the Dorothy Day Catholic Worker collection that came in with a deed of gift that was only partially signed. It was very difficult. The person who transferred the rights was very old, and it wasn't really clear. So we went back to her family and said, okay, this is what we have as far as a deed of gift. Can we act on this as the document as it stands? And we worked back with them to ensure that we were treating the collection in the appropriate way, and that all of the rights had been transferred in an appropriate manner. So it really is an ethical responsibility of the institution. The lawyer wouldn't really be able to assess archival practice. A lawyer might be able to assess whether you were turning over copyrighted material that you didn't have the ability to turn over. But I don't, like, Holly, Andrea, myself, I'm sure Michelle, I don't, maybe none of us have heard of this potential audit. Yeah.
I was going to say too, like if you are working on a contract with a receiving institution and you're not sure, please contact somebody at ACWR. We have a mentoring program. There are plenty of archivists here who would be happy to look them over for you, maybe make suggestions, kind of talk to you, especially if you don't understand what you could ask for or what you should think about. I mean, Amy went over a lot of great things, but even if you're still not sure, if you reach out to us, we can walk you through it and make sure, everything's in line with what you want to the best of the ability, given, limitations on both sides. So just keep that in mind too, that you're not just kind of hanging out there by yourself. There are plenty of people around that would be happy to help you out to make sure it's going to work.
And that's really, really a great thing. Something, because I'm not a member of the organization, I wasn't aware of. But if there is a mentoring program, use the wisdom of your colleagues. And Holly recommends a consultant. If you have knowledge of somebody within the organization, use that mentoring program. Use a colleague, work together. I mean, that is very, very powerful.
So we still have a few minutes. Does anybody else have any questions for Amy about anything with contracts, anything specific, generalities? Oh, that's right too. ACWR does have a list of consultants, mentors as well. So we do have a list of consultants. So if your community is looking to hire a consultant for any piece of a transfer, we have a list. SAA, I think, also has a list of consultants, maybe.
They do, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there are other places you can look, but you can definitely check out ACWR's website. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the Archives and Transition Toolkit does have a section on contracts. There are samples in there. Amy did send samples. I thought they went out before the webinar. I apologize. I don't think they did, but I'll make sure they get out this week so you can see the samples she referenced. And you can always go to the toolkit on the ACWR website and you can look and see what else is there. There are some samples as well. So last chance for questions, or Amy, any last thoughts?
Captive archivist, I'll answer anything.
Okay, well, it looks like we're all good. I appreciate you being with us here today, Amy, and bringing your expertise and knowledge and helping us learn more about contracts. And again, as I said, check out the toolkit. I will make sure that the resources Amy referenced get out to you this week. And if you have questions about contracts, please reach out to ACWR, to the mentoring group. We're happy to help. So, and if you have any follow-up questions, just feel free to send them to me or to Veronica, and then we can see what we can do to make sure you get an answer.
Well, thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to talk to you, and I really wish you all the best. If I can be of service to anyone, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. Michelle knows where I live.
You. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And don't forget, we have another one on restrictions in January. And in the meantime, have a good holidays.
Lovely to talk with you. Thank you.